All right, everybody, let's continue DevReach with What's New with Angular and Emma Twersky.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So as he just mentioned, my name is Emma Twersky. I'm a developer relations here at Google, and I have the pleasure of working on the Angular team. So we're here to talk about what's new with Angular. And my goal here isn't to dive super deep into any one feature, but to sort of share how the Angular team is thinking about growing, how we're thinking about what features to tackle next, and sort of like, I guess I think of it as like 3 phases of Angular, like past, present, and future, to sort of talk about where we're headed and how the core team is thinking about where we're headed. So, during COVID, I thought a lot about how we get really close to something and we frequently don't think about how it's changing, right? We can get caught up into the day-to-day, right? So like this is my desk plant the day that I went home from my job prior to joining Google, prior to COVID, right? And it's like a cute little aloe plant, and I thought I was really successful at growing this aloe plant. But the thing is, things grow quickly. And by the time well, this was taken this week, but that aloe plant essentially has like quadrupled in size. And now I realize that the previous aloe plant was like actually quite a sad plant. And by moving it to California, it is an extremely happy plant. And I think that frameworks are quite similar, right? We get really close to something, we work with it every day. It's hard to always see how much something is changing. Like maybe the apps that we're writing aren't always on the newest version. They're not always using like the newest, shiniest features. But even if maybe the work you're doing isn't quite at that like newest version, there are lots of features and they're raining down. And so the focus of this talk is to talk about the waterfall of features that have been coming to Angular and where we're sort of headed with that, from that sort of bird's eye view of looking back on maybe the sad plant and the more thriving plant now. And the thing is, you're not the only one who's noticed, right? So Angular at Google, we thought was doing really well, right? Like in 2020, there were over 2,000 projects at Angular using Google. Those go from like internal apps, like, you know, where I look to find my meal for lunch for the day from the like too many cafeterias. But that also scales up to like hundreds of thousands of millions of lines of code for like Google Cloud is Angular, right? It's like the largest app that I've ever seen. Not that lines of code necessarily means good code, but in that case, there are a ton of features on Google Cloud. But the thing is, that number has only continued to grow, right? So if we look at the exponential growth of Google at Angular, more and more projects are being started every day. We have hundreds of new developers onboarding to Angular. So growth of Angular, at least at Google, has really grown. And it's not just at Google. We have seen mass growth in community adoption over the last couple years as more and more developers have gotten into the industry. We went from 1.4 million to 2.6 million weekly NPM downloads, over 1.8 million GitHub projects. And the thing is, I always like to caveat this slide with saying like, Angular is primarily an enterprise application framework. And so nothing enterprise is ever going to be counted here. None of Google counts on this. Most of enterprise apps count on this, right? Everyone has their own private NPM registry. No one's actually going to share that. So we think these numbers are like vast underestimates of the actual number of people using Angular. And I always like to caveat that because it's really hard to picture, and it's frankly impossible because of enterprise situations, how many people are using Angular. But it's cool to see the growth, right? So to talk about Angular and the new features, I have divided things into 3 phases that I'm calling past, present, and future. And phase 1 is laying the groundwork. So we're going to take a look at some things that happened in version 12 and 13. I know to think of that as the past is ridiculous. Probably most of your apps are like somewhere even prior to this. or definitely in the like V12, V13 space. This was only a year ago. That's how fast things move. And the theme of phase one, or the past, is laying the groundwork, right? Like, how can we deliver things that maybe you're not going to see immediate benefits? And this goes from like version 2 all the way up until 13. There were a lot of things happening under the hood that allowed us to maybe develop future framework improvements, but maybe at the time you didn't fully see like why we were doing these things. And the biggest one of those is Ivy. So under the hood, we rewrote from the ground up Angular's compiler and runtime to be a more efficient Ivy rendering engine. And I'm sure if you're an Angular developer, you've heard this mentioned a lot. Project Ivy was announced maybe prematurely, but a long time ago, and it took a long time to develop. And because of that, and the reasoning behind that is that it really was a full rewrite. And the best analogy I can give, really, is that it was a rewrite of like replacing a car's engine while the car was still moving, right? So we had to provide full backwards compatibility. The car had to keep moving. Like all of these apps had to continue to work, but we had to like at one time like pull the entire engine out of the car and replace the entire engine with like a new, shinier, better engine. And if you're driving the car, you're like, why did you just do that? Like my car was moving forward fine, but that new engine meant that we could get like millions of miles further on that road trip long term. So this was like a major thing. Numerous advantages here, right? Better type checking, error reporting, debugging, smaller bundle sizes, but it really mostly just enabled future improvements. So by the time we did that engine switch out, at Google, we have some benchmarks, but we saw a 90% reduction on computational resources, which led to about 50 minutes of reduced time for a build of the largest Angular app at Google. So for each developer, having 50 minutes less build time is pretty major. When you add together, let's say like 100 developers, now that's like 500 hours or 5,000 hours, or minutes, minutes. So it comes down to like a whole person on the team, instead of sitting waiting for their build to finish, was able to like actually develop things, which at scale, when you think about the 2.6 million developers, on NPM registry using Angular, that's like hundreds of developers now, like not just sitting waiting for their build to finish, but actually continuing to like build their apps and like do cool things with Angular. Another thing that happened around this time was the introduction of an RFC process. So Angular is open source. That is like the coolest thing about it, I think. And the coolest thing about open source communities and open source frameworks isn't necessarily people opening bugs or opening PRs to fix Angular things, but the fact that everything we do is in the public. So that means like you can open an issue, you can talk to our team, we're on GitHub, like we're fully communicative. But it also means that like not only can we take the outside conversation and bring it inwards, but we can bring what we're doing on the team and share it outwards. So an RFC is a request for comment. And basically what it is our team can say like, hey, we're thinking about making this change. Before we do it, like what do all y'all, like millions of people, think about this change, right? It means that we can test what we're doing across all of the different use cases people have. And really, like a successful RFC is one where we say like, hey, we want to make this change, and someone comes up with a reason that like the way we were going to make the change doesn't work, right? I think like I had to talk a lot of people on the team through this. It's really scary to hear like, hey, like that's not going to work, but it's way better to hear like, hey, we need to think about this edge case we weren't thinking about before we actually go make the code change. So requests for comments started to pop up around like version 11, version 12. We've now formalized that process and exponentially grown that. We've launched over 15 RFCs. We've received hundreds of comments on those RFCs. They've been seen by over 1 million people on our social media. And really the point of this is that your feedback is valued and helps shape the future of Angular. And they really do just keep coming. And they can be all the way from something small like, you know, well, none of these are small. Like, hey, we want to change the date adapter. To something large like the future of Angular end-to-end testing, or removing support for IE11, or some newer ones that really show the strength of like a large RFC, like standalone components, which I'll talk about, or strictly typed forms. And again, these are things that the team was going to do anyways. But if we have a design document, why not share it? Why not battle test it against the millions of developers out there using Angular? And why not like think through some of those interesting cases ahead of time? And because of that, the designs are stronger, they're better, and we're really like taking the army of Angular and like tackling problems together. So I really think this is the future of open source. And I am proud that we're sort of like leading open communication here. So some of those RFCs at this era, as we were first testing these, were things like removal for IE11, right? Like we launched this super scared that people were going to be like, Angular is enterprise, like you can't remove IE11, like please don't do that. But the thing is, it enables like CSS variables. It enables like the modern web, essentially, CSS grid, web animations, all of these cool things. And overwhelmingly, the comments on this were like, please do it sooner rather than later. So we did it. Another one of note is Ivy library distribution, right? This was introducing a new Angular package format to modernize the package formatting and distribution of Angular packages by partially compiled Angular, removing UMD bundles, all this stuff. And this was a really good example where like not only were we changing the framework, but Angular relies on a lot of third-party packages that a lot of different people in the community maintain. And so this was important for us to have conversations with those leaders of all those different packages to say like, hey, what are you doing? How can we make sure that we can develop good packages together? Outside of RFCs, around this time, we also announced an enhanced focus on component accessibility, right? So we had this sort of North Star of Google announced a lot of things regarding a rewriting of Angular material or the material specs. And we said like, hey, we're going to take this on and we're going to make them like the most accessible possible. And we also announced ES build, right? We announced that we were going to improve the build process with an experimental ES build. So essentially like removing the build optimizer and improving builds by like 10%. By replacing them with a Babel transform. And the thing about all of those things are we were announcing changes, but we weren't necessarily making them, right? The thing about an RFC is their announcement of like what our intentions are. They're a chance to get feedback, but and they're also a chance to like introduce experimental things, but they weren't necessarily a time that those things were actually delivered. So that's why I'm calling this era like setting the groundwork. The other thing that happened around this time was a big focus on debugging. So in the 2020 customer satisfaction survey, we saw that debugging was like the #1 thing that we thought we could tackle. And if we looked into the open responses of people telling us specifically what debugging they wanted help with, it was overwhelmingly error messages. And if you've ever gotten an error message in your Angular application, which is everybody, you know that it's super frustrating, right? Nobody ever likes to be told like your app won't build. But a lot of times your app won't build, and we have to tell you something. And so we took this opportunity to say, like, let's do a lot of research. Let's identify and prioritize the top errors. And literally what I was doing was Googling like Angular error and just seeing what came up and sorting those responses. And overwhelmingly, from Stack Overflow, from GitHub issues, from all of the different places that open source exists, it was the same 10 errors, right? #1 was expression has been changed after checked. Did I get that right? We all know that error. It's grammatically correct, but it's otherwise incredibly frustrating. And so then we said, okay, well, to fix these errors, we're going to do two things. We're going to introduce an error code format. So the beginning of every error is now going to be tagged with a unique code, so we know its expression has been changed before checked. We know it's some other error. That's the only one I can name. And then we're going to make the text part of it extremely verbose. We're going to tell you exactly what's happening in that error. We're going to walk you through exactly where in your code we think that error is coming from. And then we're going to link you to guides, where on our docs we're going to say, this is the error you just ran into. This is how to fix it. So what that error experience went from is, instead of your console just showing you an error and you being frustrated and copying and pasting the exact output into Google and then wondering why nothing comes up and you realize that it's mentioning your specific app code, they now look something like this, right? So you get your error and you link directly to the Angular docs. You can scroll through, you can learn how to debug, and if you don't want to read because you're frustrated reading your error, you can just watch a video and it'll talk you through it. So this was a pretty major change of really taking the error experience and saying okay, if we have to have errors because they have to exist because your app can't always compile, at least we can make them friendly. And we have seen that since introducing them in version 11, over 1.4 million people have linked through all the way to YouTube from this video and watched those guides. So we know that of all of those people compiling Angular from NPM, quite a few people are reaching these errors, which is unfortunate, but at least they're getting the guide to fix those errors. The next thing we introduced for debugging is Angular DevTools, which I've trademarked, but it's not really trademarked. And the thing about Angular DevTools is we wanted to improve the experience of profiling and understanding change detection within your Angular app. So things that Chrome DevTools or whatever browser's DevTools you work in can't do themselves because it's Angular-specific knowledge. So we partnered with the Chrome team as well as some third-party resources to introduce Angular DevTools. So you can explore what triggered change detection, how much time Angular spent in each change detection cycle, as well as really digging into the code to understand where those changes are coming from, what your component structure is, the component tree, and a lot of really cool stuff like that. And since launching this, we've seen millions of downloads on the Chrome extension page. So that has been really cool. So really the focus of this was unlocking future potential, right? We have DevTools, we have error structures, and we have this RFC process that allows us to better communicate with the third-party developers that are using our apps. And we announced a bunch of changes, right? We delivered Ivy, but we didn't really deliver anything that we promised Ivy would be able to unlock. But the promise of all of this was that there's future potential. And there's still reasons to update those, right? There's new versions of stuff. There's lots of goodies included, but at a high level of features, these versions were really about creating a path to the future of what we wanted Angular to be. So that's where our next phase comes in. And version 13 and 14, I'm labeling as developer preview. So now that we've laid the groundwork, we wanted to start delivering features in preview for people to be able to change the way that you're authoring Angular apps, to be able to utilize some of the benefits of things that Ivy unlocked, to be able to start delivering some of these RFCs. So one of the biggest ones was we had these two RFCs that mentioned standalone. I'm just calling it standalone. You may have heard it called standalone components, the removal of ng modules. I'm branding it as standalone. And what standalone is the idea that if this is your app right now, and this is a component, and you're building your component, and somewhere in this world there's an ng module, and we're not even going to look at it because it's confusing, and it's an extra thing that you have to learn. And if you're a new developer, there are other things that use the word module that you're learning about at the same time. But now you have this ng module, which is like an Angular specific thing. So standalone is designed to simplify all of that and streamline the steps to getting started. And so by introducing this standalone true flag, you can bootstrap your component directly and you don't need a module. So it's this idea that no more modules are necessary, bootstrap it directly, and we can now deliver standalone components. Your entire app can be standalone. And we released this as developer preview while also introducing the term developer preview. And the idea here is like, Angular is very committed to backwards compatibility. Again, like talking about that enterprise space, something Angular does really well, and one of its strengths is the fact that like we promise anything we introduce to an API change will be backwards compatible. Anything that we deprecate will be deprecated for 2 versions before we remove it. Right, there's this really stable place that Angular exists in within frameworks. So this is like a major change, right? We're saying like, okay, you write your apps one way, you have this module, now we're gonna remove it completely. Like you don't actually have to do that. We have these new APIs. And so by introducing these as developer preview, we were marking that like, hey, we might wanna change these. We underwent these RFCs, we think this is gonna look really good, but just in case, we want to not promise backwards compatibility because then we'd have to wait 2 versions to change. Let's say like standalone is confusing and we want to call it like, you know, no module or something that would be even worse. But the point is, if we wanted to change that flag, we would have to wait 2 versions. It would be super confusing. And if we want to rapidly grow and rapidly change the framework, we want to make sure that we have the umbrella of safety of developer preview to know that like, if you use this in production, just know that like we could potentially change it, and we will do our best not to. The next thing that we did was another RFC. So if you notice the pattern, everything that we're doing is connected to an RFC for the most part. And this one is on strictly typed forms. And this one came directly from the fact that our #1 GitHub issue with the most thumbs up was the idea that people wanted to add strict typing to forms. So Angular was really early in its adoption of TypeScript. That's another thing that Angular got really right from the beginning. And at the time, right, TypeScript didn't have a lot of support. Like people were like, why are you using this language that nobody else is using? This is super confusing, and like why are types so great? It turns out that was like the correct bet. And one of those things meant that at the beginning, the forms package didn't include a lot of the strict typing. But we knew that we could add typing and make it better, right? So strict typing to forms introduced this idea that types from forms. So forms are now type safe, they're null safe, and they add typing for all of the model classes. You can build much more complex nested forms, and we can know that with backwards compatibility, we can throw a lot more errors, right? We can be sure that your forms work a lot better. We can know that like substring doesn't exist on lives, right? That's a number, confusing. We know that like there is not an email value in this form that I created. And we know that like you cannot create the name key, right? So this was a really big one. If you use forms, newest version, you'll on how to do that. Diagnostics. And so extended diagnostics are this idea that we have really good error messaging, we feel, but that happens at the time after you've compiled, after you're in the browser, a lot of the time, right? Like you've already written the code, you're already out of your code. And so extended diagnostics, like, hey, we can actually do a lot of Angular knowledge type checking from within your code editor, and we can supply ways for your code editor to do a lot of that. Oops. Yeah. So if you watch this video, like I'm in my code editor, I'm in my template, and I can see that if I like hover over this issue, This is a super common one. We call it banana in a box, right? Where like in Angular, we know that frequently like the banana, the parentheses, are supposed to go in the brackets. Angular fondly calls it banana in a box, right? It's a common error in people's templates, especially if you're new to Angular. You're like, why do I have brackets? Why do I have parentheses? Why is that a thing? But now if you type that code in your code editor, oops, I'm just gonna repeat the video. We can throw the error right there, right? So you don't get to the point of compiling. If you're a new developer, you like see that error earlier, you can fix it earlier. You're not like getting to your browser and like confused about why your inputs and outputs aren't working. Similarly, we did that for nullable chaining, right? So like if we know that user ID is non-nullable, then we don't need to do a null check and nullish coalescing on that value in your template. So we can say like, hey, we know from your Angular template, this is never gonna be nullable, you don't need to do this check. Just go ahead and like have a better experience in your template, right? And the power here isn't those two diagnostics. Those were just two really easy demos to introduce. The power here is that we introduced a scalable and extendable framework for how to introduce errors to the framework. So extended diagnostics are meant to be introduced. We've worked with partners and have a ton more diagnostics. This has really scaled up exponentially. But the thing here is like if you know there's an error that your new developers or any developers are running into, that can be caught in the template because of template syntax, because of something Angular specific about your template. This is a great way to take the errors out of the browser and bring them earlier in the development cycle so that you're having a better development experience. And then finally, we have ng completion by default. So this is a super simple fix, but I think this is like one of the coolest. But this is in the CLI, autocomplete, right? So if you update to version 14, you'll automatically get this prompt that says, hey, do you want to add to your bash profile or whatever profile you use, autocomplete. And by tab completing, you can see all of the different things you can do with the Angular CLI, right? Like the Angular CLI is super, super complex. There's like a ton of options, but it's not the most discoverable. So if you're ng generating a component and you don't know all the flags you can do, this is a great way to look at all the things that I can like ng add, build, do all these things, right? It also means that like if you're prone to typos like me, you have to type significantly less in the CLI. And this was, again, enabled by Ivy. This was enabled by like all of that previous work and laying the groundwork that we can now do a lot of this in the browser. We can make the features better. So again, like all of the things in this phase were about improving developer experience, right? Unlocking better developer experience, all the things that we said that Ivy could unlock, autocomplete, typed forms, standalone components was like the biggest one, right? Like we could introduce developer previews of what we thought a better experience would be, and we could introduce frameworks that would be scalable to do that, right? So now we enter into phase 3, which is the fruits of our hard work. And yes, avocado is a fruit. And this phase is really about seeing, well, this phase has yet to happen, frankly. Version 15 is scheduled for November, so this is very speculative and early preview. But the idea here is like really everything that we unlocked in those early versions, everything that we've previewed now, like it really shouldn't be a surprise where we're headed in many ways. We've hinted at it very openly. That's the thing about open source. It's not really a secret. And the number one is full standalone, right? So I said it's developer preview. We weren't committing to like these APIs being 100%. And now we are, right? We've seen like great feedback. We want to build up like schematics, all of the things you need to do this stably and fully and in a production setting. So this becomes not something that we like are pretty sure about, but that we actually have like full support around. And Pavel actually has a talk later today that I highly recommend that digs way deeper into standalone components beyond this one slide that I have now shown you twice. And that really is, again, one of those like staples of the framework and the future of Angular. The next is the tree shakeablest router that we have yet. So one of the cool things about standalone and about all of these different projects and things we've been developer previewing is that we got to rewrite a lot of parts of Angular that haven't had the attention recently, or we didn't even know the benefits that would come out of it, right? And one of those things that has seen major benefits that will come in the next version is the router. So in writing standalone versions of the router, we were able to integrate a lot of things, change a lot of things about the router module for apps that no longer need modules to make them significantly more tree shakeable. And tree shakeable in Angular is this idea that we have a lot of code, but your apps don't use all that code, and so some point in compilation, we can get rid of a lot of the code that you're not using, so that what we're actually delivering to the browser is a much smaller version, pared down, of the things that you're actually using from the framework in Angular. So what we want to do and what the North Star is delivering only what you need at that end stage. And the router is a great place where we got to tree shake a lot of the router away. So if you're not using it, we're no longer having to supply you with it. And one of the best examples of that is in the Bootstrap application function. So you can now provide the provide routers array where you're supplying all your app routes. So in this before and after, right, you used to have to, from your router module, supply all of your routes in for root. We now have an updated function where you'll just provide your router and you'll link all of your apps routes. This can take a list of routes. So let's say you have multiple routes, lazy loaded routes, all of that stuff. This accounts for all of that. And the new config API allows developers to tree shake major pieces of the router API. And it's the first time that we've had the ability to enable this level of tree shaking in the Angular router, right? So this was sort of a product of all of that, laying the groundwork of Ivy, then introducing developer preview of standalone, and now we're at this place where we can tree shake significant parts of the router for the first time because of the opportunities and things that we've laid along the way. Similar, extended diagnostics. So I mentioned, and I don't have examples here, but we have seen tons of new extended diagnostics added third party. This is a great place to contribute to Angular if that's something you're interested in. So now we have warnings when you're missing a let on your ng4. We have non-nullable option chain errors. We can detect missing control flow directive imports in standalone components. There's a lot of stuff in this standalone space that we can directly warn from directly in your template. And we have a scalable way for you to introduce errors to do that directly in your code editor. Another one is, I don't know if you remember, but error messages equal lots of confusion. And that's not just Angular, right? Error messages in developer, becoming a software engineer means seeing errors, and they're also our least favorite part of development, especially when you don't know how to fix the error. So a collaboration that we did with Chrome DevTools was to say hey, we don't like these error messages we're getting with these stack traces that make no sense. And so we collaborated with a fix that will fix a fix for the entire ecosystem. So even if you're not an Angular developer and you somehow made it this far in my talk, we have something that will benefit everyone, which is Zone.js enabled async stack tagging by default, but we're just calling better stack traces. And so the idea here is this is a common stack trace you see where you have this error, there's an uncaught promise, and it's somewhere in your app, right? And this is super confusing. I have no idea what half this stuff is because it's not coming from code I ever wrote, right? You have to go into code you didn't write, you're trying to figure it out, you can't change it, you didn't write it. Or you can, but that's open source and that's super complicated. So step one is that we took that messy stack trace and we really synthesized it down to just what's relevant. So just what's relevant in that stack trace. And producing such a cryptic error is blocking you from actually debugging the error, right? So remove everything that calls framework code not coming from you, things that you can't touch. Next, we then try and tag it to everything linked, right? So we look at anything that was in the stack trace that we can actually point to where in your app code, like code you authored, that is linked to. And then finally, what will happen in version 15 is we're introducing like friendly stack traces, which is this final part, which is going to say like exactly at what point in app code authored that you wrote is this error coming from. So this is coming from my app component in line 4, and I know that that's the line of code doing it. So instead of like that confusing thing where I don't know what zone.js is at the bottom of this, or I do, but like I'm never going to look at line 1134 and like know anything, I'm getting a much friendlier place to start in my debugging. So this was a super cool collaboration with Chrome, and this means that like those linked debugging tools, those better stack traces, like you can go into the Chrome profiler, Chrome debugger, and we can link way better into like the actual code you wrote so that you can debug those apps. And you're not getting like stuck in zone.js, basically. Other things include npm init and yarn create. So in a minor, like you no longer need to install the Angular CLI globally. You can just run yarn create Angular and like name your app. All of the same things work, all the same options as ng new. You just no longer have to have a global version that you're keeping up to date with the latest versions. And this is great for if you're like teaching Angular for the first time, right? Like you don't have to touch this like global space of Angular on their computer. Just like get started with one line. Like way simpler, again, especially if you have autocomplete, like you basically have to type 3 things. Another collaboration was the optimized image component, which again, in collaboration with Chrome, we got together and said, like, Chrome Aurora is very focused on optimizing the web, especially according to Core Web Vitals. And Core Web Vitals are this user-centric metric that allows you to optimize for faster user experience. And so what we came up with is if this is an image right now, all you have to do is change to an ng source and import the optimized image directive to your app. And we can now optimize your image for those Core Web Vitals so that we can know that we don't actually need to load them for first contentful paint. So your first contentful paint will see significant improvements. The benchmarks here are around like 40% improvement in desktop apps on your Core Web Vital scores for first contentful paint. So really cool benefits. And again, like ng source from, source to ng source, pretty easy. So really small changes that rely on like the bulk of everything I've just talked about earlier in this talk that laid the groundwork for this. So again, that's what that looks like, but you're just importing it into your standalone component. It's standalone as a directive. You're importing it directly, and that template is going to be optimized. And then finally, when you close one GitHub first issue, you have a new GitHub first issue, it turns out what happens. And so our new GitHub first issue of most thumbs up, now that strict typing for forms is closed, is host directives on your components. So if you have, let's say, like multiple directives, a tooltip, and a menu, and you're applying them to a component, host directives are an upcoming RFC for how you can apply multiple directives to a singular component and control the inputs and outputs and make that a more interactable interface. We also have some cool stuff that I have no code for, but we're looking at things like hiding CLI configs by default, right? Like, do you really need config files if you're not going to make any changes for them in your new app? We have this North Star of MDC, so if you use Angular Material, MDC is like the newest, shiniest, most accessible specs for that. That's happening under the hood by default. And if you remember that RFC process, we have some really exciting RFCs planned around things like hydration and things that many other talks today are focused on, but we are definitely also focusing on. And really the focus here is like the future is what the unlocked future is. So there's a lot to be excited about right now, and I want to thank everyone for being a part of this community in all of the ways that you do, and ng update to this future potential. Check us out on YouTube and Twitter. Check me out on those if you have any questions about this stuff. My handle's been in the bottom. And thank you. I have 5 minutes for questions if anyone has them. But I doubt anyone's going to raise their hand.
I would just like an appreciation on the better hair.
Thank you.
This might be a better question for the other talk later, but is the standalone kind of expected to become like the thing, like the new way of doing things?
We don't have, but before we have an answer for that, we will have schematics on what that app looks like. So right now you can create a single component, like with a schematic, right? The -- standalone will create like one app, and we know what that looks like. We don't know what a whole standalone app looks like. Like, where do we bootstrap the app? Like, what file does that exist in? And so we need answers for those things before it ever would become like the future. I think like much more likely there's some sort of hybridized approach, at least for like the next many versions, especially in like enterprise spaces. Like the question to ask is like, how big is this component and can it be standalone? And it's probably more of a piecemeal like transition. And then once we figure out answers to some of these bigger questions, like then the question is like, is this default? I'm looking at Paul because the speaker for the talk is behind you. Yeah. Come end your day with us answering those big questions. Brokey, did you have a question?
I did. So
Okay.
with the stack trace improvements,
Yeah.
is that just related to zones, or is it just across all of Chrome for a lot of different libraries?
It's across Chrome for a lot of different libraries, specifically focused at any code you didn't author. We used, the reason Angular partnered with Chrome on that project is that Zone.js is like a really good example where like, I write a lot of Angular apps, and I have no idea what Zone is doing. And if you talk to the Angular team, like most of the team also doesn't know what's happening in Zone.js. So like stack traces, no, I think that's fine, right? Like we didn't write that code, so like you were not expected to fix things in that code. So yeah, it's across packages, but Zone.js was a good example of like a large package frequently tagged in stack traces.
In my mind, RxJS comes to mind.
Yeah, and then I think the question is like, when do you want to link to other things? Probably never is my answer. But yeah, cool. Jeff.
Actually, some of that, there was some discussion about potentially allowing for a zoneless, using Angular without zone at some point. And so does that mean, like obviously, it only affects where currently zones are tracking certain things where you get better error messages. But could theoretically we not get some of those good error messages then if you did not use zones, if that is something that's going to happen?
Yeah, so the question was like, if we remove zones, then you don't have this error with stack traces, sort of. I mean, yeah, so then like the stack traces would link to the good code anyways. Like then we wouldn't have to have fixes. I think it was still worth fixing. There are other packages that this happens for. But in theory, yeah, if you remove the package doing the code that you didn't write that's throwing the error, then you're not going to see that error. Cool. Yeah, feel free to ask questions throughout the day, but thank you.